So everyone, thanks again, Julie. And as I said, it's a bit of a strange space. Like I have text, so I'm trying to navigate talking to you and doing slideshows and everything else. So bear with me, please. And as I said, I can't move, so I'll go with that. So look, welcome everybody, and I'd like to thank you for coming along to today's session. First of all, I'll see if this works. As per my abstract, and I'm assuming that some of you may have read it and that's why you've come to this session, or it might just be that you're in the space in your schools where you need to be here anyway. So what I am going to do today is have a look at what critical literacy is and what it comes to mean to do critical literacy in the classroom. And so when Julie phoned me up to invite me to do this presentation, she was really interested in me laying out the space of what critical literacy is, and like she said, to get you thinking about what are the theoretical underpinnings that we can then start thinking about applying to this new syllabus. Okay? All right, so given that, because I have 50 minutes essentially, what I've tried to do is stick to the time frame and focus specifically, while a little bit on the syllabus as a whole, but on Unit 4 in particular. And you'll understand why I come to that point when I actually talk about the tenets of critical literacy. Okay. So as such, we're going to look at a number of questions, and I will do I'll work through the presentation as a way of answering those questions that appear in the abstract. So before we go any further, I do have a couple of questions just so I get a sense of who you are in the room to help me out as we go forward today. Could you pop your hand up for me if you've engaged in the essential English to this point? Okay, and leave your hand up for me, please, if it's been to a really significant extent, like you're in there. Okay, thank you. What about those of you who've not yet engaged in the syllabus to date, but you're here starting from a fairly... Yeah, only a couple. Okay, so most people are familiar with what it looks like. Can I get a show of hands too from those of you who have actually had experience working in the English communication syllabus in the past? Haven't we all? Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm now going to get you to work in pairs, or given that we've got this set up in the tables as you choose to, really, and I want you to work through an activity for me. And that is that I actually want you to consider who you anticipate will be the students in your Essential English classroom in 2019 and beyond. That is, what do they look like as a cohort? And what do they look like as individuals? But before we move on to the activity, and I have a handout that we'll distribute in a minute, I'm going to make an assumption, and it is just that, it's an assumption on my behalf, that for the most part, and as Julie flagged, what might that mean for these students in terms of what the syllabus does look like, but for the most part, they will be the students who, up to this point, have perhaps been those in your English communication classes. Okay, so I'm going to give you, I'll start with 5 minutes. I was going to give you 10, but I seem to have rattled on more than I should have. So if we go with 5, I appreciate that it's not a lot of time, but we have an hour max. So we'll give out the handout, and I've got the questions on the back and data on the front. So what you'll see in this data, Julie, if I can keep going while you do give that out, is what you're going to get is data from 2015 to 2017 of the students who were enrolled in English communication within Queensland and the level of achievements that they attained. Okay, so there are a couple of questions, as I said, which are on the text for you. So what I'm actually asking you to do at this point really is to start doing some of the critical literacy work that we might expect our students to do. And that is to ask questions of a text and to interrogate the meanings that we can see presented in that text. Okay, so 5 minutes for a very quick chat. I apologise. Thanks. Okay. So what I would like to say is that clearly this is the kind of conversation that you can take back and have in your staff rooms around what it might be that you need to start thinking about in terms of who are your cohort coming in based on that assumption. As I walked around the room, there were some really interesting conversations and things that, I could hear people talking about QCE and implications for pathways and all of those things that you may, and going on to higher education. So it might be that they're the types of things that you can start thinking about in your school contexts. So it was simply a prompt to get you to start thinking about, as you're working on building these new programs and implementing them, what it might look like. So given that I gave you 5 minutes, you can appreciate, you can have whole sessions on this, and perhaps, Julie, that's what I should have done, had a whole session on that. But I'm just going to give you a typical example of a reading. That is my reading. So just one reading, given that we know there's multiple readings. And as I said, I can hear lots of other different conversations as I walked around. But this is just something for you to think about in terms of the reading that I've done of this text. So in thinking about how you're positioned to read it, what you'll see is in preparing this text, I actually provided you with the information that this was in fact sourced from the QCAA. Okay, so you would therefore assume that in some ways that it would be authoritative data, okay, that you could consider it valid and reliable. What I didn't actually tell you was that it's publicly available data. So in leaving that out, it may well be that you would have thought that it was even more valid and reliable, yeah, if you were to reconsider having that extra piece of information. So what did I omit from the text, and what purpose did that serve? I actually kept you in the dark a little bit as readers. So the more we can gain access in texts, they help us to read them. If we look at the ways in which the data was presented in this text, and again, I did it quite deliberately, and as we do, as producers of text, we manipulate what we put in them for particular purposes. So I chose to focus on gender specifically and across 3 years. I originally started with 5 years of data. Can you imagine how long I would have taken to stop you if I had given you 5 years of data? So I pulled it back to 3, but I thought in doing that I was still going to be able to produce a text that gave you enough to be able to interpret the patterns that I saw, to position you to see in the text. So what we can see from the data is that if we looked at the pattern of gender, there appears a relatively consistent pattern around gender if we look at it as 2 discrete cohorts, both in terms of the number of boys and girls who enrol and the levels of achievement that they achieve across the 3 years. When we drill down a little bit and we compare the 2 cohorts, what we can also see is that more boys than girls undertook English communication. And I'm imagining that might be your lived experience. And also, and again consistently, that girls outperformed the boys in English communication, and particularly at that VHA level. That may or may not be your experience. But statewide, that's what the data suggests. In terms of thinking about our students and who has engaged over those 3 years, I would think that there'd be questions I'd like to ask, and that's about the disaggregation of data to give me a more nuanced reading of who my students are. Okay, so we might like to think about things like, who are the boys and girls sitting in our classroom? They're not homogenous groups, and we all know that as teachers. So we might want to think about what is her or his background. If we're thinking about SES, what geographical location is this data being drawn from? Yeah? Do they identify as Indigenous Australians? What class background might they come from? What does the school context look like? So there's questions like that. And what funds of knowledge do they bring to school from home? So I'd like you now, as I move back to the abstract, as we move through the presentation, to keep in mind the knowledge you have of your students and those you anticipate being in your your essential English classes. I would ask you to consider too how critical literacy pedagogy might come to serve these students well. And given that critical literacy pedagogy, in my view, is writ large in the essential English syllabus, I'd like you to think about how the subject will in turn serve to enable your students. Okay? How it is that they're going to position if you engage in this critical literacy within your essential English, how might you serve to position your students both as students now and into the future. How might this subject assist them in preparing for the fulfilment of their imagined futures? So how is it that they may see their aspirations and their goals fulfilled as they do move out into what is a very rapidly changing and globalised world? So what is critical literacy? The term critical has distinctive etymology, and it is that it comes from the ability to argue and judge. Yeah, so not surprisingly, we would expect that we will see that flavour through what is critical literacy pedagogy. Critical literacy pedagogy is described by Alan Luke, who's a key writer in the field, as the object of a half-century of theoretical debate and practical innovation in the field of education. Defining the term, and indeed its parameters, is challenging, and it is intentionally so. Numerous critical theorists, including Luke, have intentionally resisted the development of any narrow methodology that claimed to formulaically enact critical literacy. Okay, so no singular unified definition. There is no correct or universal model, and you'll see why as I unpack today. So with this acknowledged, theorists and educators actually say that this space is one that should look and feel different. Okay? So while not universal, but should look and feel different. And I would suggest different to what was an older didactic pedagogy. All right. Importantly, critical literacy is an overtly political in its orientation. It is focused on the uses of literacy for social justice, and it is about aiming to critique and transform the worlds in which we live. And not only that, but in terms of engaging with the curriculum, transforming text, I would suggest. Okay, so it melds social, political and cultural debate and discussions with the analysis of how texts and discourses work, where, with what consequences, and in whose interests. Furthermore, as educators, it is us who shape and deploy the tools, the attitudes and philosophies of critical literacy. So it's utterly contingent on where we find ourselves. So you will all have very different contexts to work in. What unites you is a single syllabus from which to work from. Okay. So it is based on our policy context. Sorry, I've jumped the gun. So I would suggest to you that in view of our policy context, that is one of Queensland, as I've said before, I think this syllabus serves as both enabled and enabling when it comes to critical literacy practice. I'm really quite excited about what it offers you as classroom teachers when working with students. There's so much potential there, as I see it. Okay. So I'm now going to attend to the origins of critical literacy, just to give you a bit of a frame up, and I'm going to draw specifically on the theorist Paulo Freire's work and the work that he did with his colleagues. And I'll do this in a way so that you can see the key underpinnings, yeah, that have come to inform critical literacy. It has a long history, as Alan Luke said, 50 plus years. So these key underpinnings are what you will see coming through the flavour of the syllabus that you've been asked to work with. All right? So, now to the right slide. Paulo Freire is, as I said, often recognised as the initiator of critical literacy. It is widely acknowledged that the critical literacy practices propagated from the social justice pedagogy of the Brazilian educator and theorist, and were first described in his publications Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Education, the Practice of Freedom. So these were published in 1968 and 1972. Yeah. So we have quite the history. Arguably, much of the earliest scholarship on critical literacy is framed within Freirean pedagogy. So for Freire, he had three key educational projects that he worked on. And you'll see the language, as I said, floating through the Essential English syllabus. That is, he spoke of try that again. That is, he spoke of critical thinking, critical consciousness, and critical pedagogy. And that's what we're interested in as part of our critical literacies framework. So for Henry Giroux, he suggests that what Paulo Freire made clear in Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that pedagogy is neither about training, it's not about a teaching method, and it's not about political indoctrination. For Freire, it is not something to be imposed on students. So think about that. Okay. What it is, it's about giving students, providing them with the opportunities to explore the possibilities of what it means to be critical citizens. That is also to expand their participation in society in ways that serve democracy. Essentially, Freire's conception of critical pedagogy forges an expanded notion of politics and agency through a language of scepticism and possibility and a culture of openness, debate and engagement. Yeah. So scepticism, possibility, openness, debate and engagement. Key words that you will see mark up the essential English syllabus. Okay. In the same vein, for Freire, critical thinking was about offering a way to think beyond the present, soaring beyond the immediate confines of one's experiences, entering into a critical dialogue with history and imagining a future that would merely not represent the present. So Freire centred on key concepts, including the notion that literacy education should highlight the critical consciousness of learners. Yeah? As Vaquez writes, in his work in the 1970s, Freire wrote that if we consider learning and to read and write as acts of knowing, then readers and writers must assume the role of creative subjects who reflect critically. Okay? They also need to reflect on language and its significance. All right. In the 1980s, Freire went on to work with Donaldo Macedo, and they popularised, and I'm sure you've all probably heard this term, they popularised the notion that reading is more than decoding words, that reading the word is in fact simultaneously about reading the world. Okay, so reading the word, reading the world. So that is, in terms of the performance of critical reading, it's a reading in which we unpack the myths and falsehoods and we seek to create new ways of knowing and being and of acting upon the world. And you'll see flavours of this as I talk about the tenets of critical literacy. Literacy, Reading the Word and the World, published in 1987, offered an expansive tome of literacy and critical literacy. Herein, Freire and Macedo make claim that those who are critically literate can not only understand how meaning is socially constructed within texts, but can also come to understand the political and economic context in which these texts were created and therefore embedded. So for us, this means that our reading of any text is mediated by our day-to-day experience and the places, the spaces and the languages with which we engage. Also in the 1980s, Freire's work with Ira Shaw, notably A Pedagogy for Liberation, turned attention to the focus on critical literacy as ideology critique, something I'm sure you're already very familiar with. More specifically, they focused on ideology critique of the world as it's portrayed in media, literature, textbooks and functional texts. So again, there's that idea of a range of texts. In essence, according to Freire, underlying critical literacy is a definition of literacy as primarily a social practice. For Freire, as Giroux notes, all education in the broadest sense was part of a project of freedom and eminently political because it offered students the conditions of self-reflection, a self-managed life, and notions of critical agency. So again, think about the students in your classroom. What might this mean for them? Along with this is an ethical and social responsibility to humanely transform the world in which they live. How are you going to position your students to engage in this kind of work? Okay, in the case of critical literacy, it is that there are various models, theoretical frames, paradigms, if you like, or traditions of scholarship that have influenced definitions of critical literacy education and what it's come to look like in practice. So the list is there for you, and it's quite substantial. So as I indicated at the start, there is really, clearly, as you can see, if there are so many influential paradigms, it's no wonder that there is no one definition of critical literacy. And it is the case that these toolkits or combinations have occasioned different orientations and various proclivities to critical literacy. Historically, and taken together, these diverse models or paradigms have informed critical literacy practice as we know it today, and certainly as we know it in Queensland schools. Yeah. Okay, so in acknowledging the difficulty of pinning down what is critical literacy, given all of the competing paradigms that inform it, I'd like to attend now to some of the key tenets that underpin and inform critical literacy practice. And when I do this, I hope to make some links for you around what it might look like in the classroom and get you thinking about how it is that you're going to then enact those. So there are a whole range, as I said, and these are those. Up front, I would assert that critical literacy should not be an add-on, okay? It should not be a topic that you're going to cover, a unit that you're going to study, or an assessment piece for the sake of assessment. Rather, it should be an ongoing practice. It needs to be part of your toolkit, part of your repertoire of everyday practice in your classroom. And it should provide students with a framework that they can use to participate both in school but also beyond the school gates. Yeah? It's also important to note that this framework does not necessarily involve taking a negative stance. Often people think, oh, critical literacy, it's about, reading the text and looking for what's wrong with it. Not so, yeah? What it is about is looking at a topic or an issue in different ways, analysing it, and being able to suggest possibilities for change and improvement. In this regard, critical literacies needs to be, I would suggest, but should be, pleasurable and transformational, pedagogical as well as transgressive. And I note in the literature session that I was in yesterday morning, Lisa spoke about the QCA receiving feedback on, the trial for the literature syllabus. And part of the feedback was, don't kill the text. And I think this is the stuff that this alludes to. We want to make it pleasurable as well. And I'll get onto that when I'm talking about popular culture, but it is important. It's not about killing the text that we've got in front of us. It should be, as I've said, a resource for students to do the kind of life work that they need to do. So, in terms of social justice and underpinning as the first tenet of critical literacy, it certainly does have a strong foundation in this, and this harks back to the work of Paulo Freire and this notion of social justice. We, as I've said, identify that critical literacy involves questioning and making sense of our socio-political world. We want to foreground who is privileged and with more power and who is not. Such work practically sees students engage with social issues such as race, class, gender or disability, and the ways in which language use or discursive practice comes to shape our understandings of these issues. Critical literacy pedagogy from this perspective, that of social justice, involves students as social actors, raising questions of local or personal concern or of wide-pressing human issues. And it does address difficult issues to which there may be no clear answer, certainly no easy answer. Okay. But we have to remember too that its aim is to engage students in exercising and nurturing purposeful and reflective habits of mind and action. Okay. In terms of critical thinking, and again in the spirit of Freire, as you'd note from the earlier slides, This is about engaging with students and asking them to engage in a critical dialogue in our classrooms. We want them reading both the word and the world. In adopting an approach to critical literacy which frames up this notion of critical thinking, we are then enabled to develop a more nuanced reading of contemporary social, economic, political issues. In terms of this notion of critical thinking, the aim of critical literacies is to help learners understand the ways in which things are constructed in the world by people's values and actions. If we think about this in textual terms, a critically literate person identifies relevant and powerful topics, analyses and documents evidence, considers alternative points of view, formulates possible solutions to the problems, and in some instances, they actually engage in transformational work where they'll go and actually try out their solution to see if it is in fact transformative. And we want them then to come to their own conclusions, but also to be able to make well-reasoned arguments to support what it is that they come to in the end. Okay, so the third tenet of critical literacy practice is the notion of transformation and emancipation. And again, there's a clear link here to the first two, of social justice and critical thinking. This kind of literacy, again, leads back to that notion by Giroux of conditions for self-reflection, a self-managed life, and a notion of critical agency. In this manner, it's about empowering individuals. Yeah? Because when we empower them, we can get them to discover their voices in the world and also their ethical responsibilities to use literacy for the good of the world. In terms of applying this particular pedagogy, we're thinking about the process of reading and writing about the world in which literate citizens become subjects instead of passive objects of the texts. That is, agents instead of victims of the text. And I would advocate that there too is that clear link when we come to talk about popular culture, that is in fact the case. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to put my foot down. Okay, the next tenet underpinning critical literacy is that of the democratic curriculum. And I think this is an interesting space for teachers because it does mean that we have to do classroom practice potentially very differently. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I come to popular culture because I think it's particularly relevant in that context. But it's at this point that we disrupt what is the traditional sense of knowledge and authority and the power relations between teachers and students. But in this space of democratic curriculum, we do want students to be afforded space to tackle real world issues. Yeah? And also, let's not forget, to create texts that address questions of concern and interest to them and to their communities. Yeah? So we're not just asking them to be the recipients of text. We want them engaged in critical ways, in ways that enable them to transform their world. Okay, literacy and identity. And of course, all of this is tied to this notion, everything that I've said to date. This pedagogy comes with the recognition that all representation and communication involves human identities. That is, that literacy and identity are inextricably interconnected. The possession and use of literacy and of particular practices that we choose to take up does in fact inscribe the identity of the user. That is, the who and the what we are. Okay. And this type of critical literacy also recognises that there are in fact differences in our human identities and amongst our human identities. So this version of critical literacy brings a rich cacophony of student voices into the classroom and validates popular ways of speaking and identities. Here, students, positioned as agentic subjects, determine which meanings are important to them, and the curriculum starts with them. And in saying that, I recognise that it starts with them to a certain point because we nonetheless live in a world of high accountability And we are, in fact, those who are enacting a particular curriculum, in this case, the Essential English curriculum. But it does nonetheless confirm and critically engage, students through their own voice and the fact that they are constructed as social identities. The other thing that this particular framework asks us to do, and certainly asks our students to do, is to engage sometimes as inward-looking, where they actually consider those who are othered to them. So, for example, students with a disability, a different sexual orientation, different ethnic group or racial group. And in terms of the text, and looking at text from within this tenet of critical literacy, we see that the influence of the text, and specifically of identities in text, come to position our readers. It is recognised that texts are permeated with the markers, social and cultural inscriptions, such as race, gender and class. And I know as we look at the syllabus, those words are actually there for us to use and engage with. So we look at this from a way of the sites of struggle around power and who comes to be represented, whose identities come to count. Okay. So in terms of finding voice, critical literacy pedagogies are organised around the voice and agencies of learners. And again, as I said, all of these are so interwoven, as to become quite complex, but nonetheless complementary. So this kind of tenet of critical literacy asks us to provide students with ways in which to have their voice heard. The aim of critical literacy is that students can acquire the pedagogical courage and moral responsibility, so harking back to transformation and emancipation, to participate in democratic life as critical social agents, transforming themselves into authors of their own histories rather than being written off as the passive victims of history. And again, think about your students and what that might mean for them. How are you going to empower them in such a way as to give them voice? So, in finding voice, Ira Shaw says that we are what we say and do. The way we speak shapes us and the people we become. It is through words and, of course, other actions that we build ourselves in the world, while at the same time recognising that the world is building us. It is noteworthy, I think, at this point to clarify, particularly when we apply this to classroom practice, that finding a voice does not necessarily mean that we identify ourselves with any or all of the texts of the world that we encounter, but rather that we can, given that we are, if we are positioned as agentic subjects, we can in fact resist and we can in fact reject the voices of the storylines that are on offer to us. So, to the big one. Okay. Popular culture. So popular culture is another focus area in critical literacy, okay, and quite a strong focus of critical literacy. So, water before I run, yeah? So, in an older didactic pedagogy, the mass and popular media were regarded as mere entertainment, devoid of aesthetics and associated with the vulgarities of popular taste. In this pedagogical paradigm, popular culture, that is, the culture of the people, the culture of the masses, was viewed as other to the serious work of literacy learning. This, however, is no longer the case in terms of contemporary approaches to practice in our classrooms, and certainly to contemporary literacy studies. And the fact is that this particular shift is very much evident in the Essential English syllabus. In the case of the Essential English syllabus, popular culture is not only not ignored, but is in fact foregrounded as a valid and valued focus of study in Unit 4. Hence why I find this syllabus very exciting. Here in Unit 4, with its focus on representations and popular culture texts, it is the case that it is unequivocally framed by and within a critical literacy paradigm. For as I note here, popular culture is one of the tenets underpinning and informing critical literacy. So as I said at the start, writ large, and while across all 4 units, this one you simply cannot escape, yeah? Not that you would want to. In the syllabus, a range of popular culture texts that could be studied are offered in the unit. And these include film, television, novels, short stories, short videos, photography, street art, graphic novels, music lyrics and music videos, computer games and apps, documentaries and mockumentaries, drama texts, and a range of digital texts. And so while I'm not focusing on assessment here today, Julie is running some sessions this afternoon, and I think what we'd like to foreground to you is that there's so much that is available to you in terms of potential text to use. Don't get locked into tunnel vision about, oh, a popular text is a novel. Yeah? There's so much out there. And I appreciate that there are resourcing issues in schools and it looks different for people in different contexts. But don't let go of what are the possibilities, especially if you're thinking about all of those tenets that I've talked about so far. Yeah? How is it that we're going to engage our students in ways that are going to enable them as citizens of the future? Okay. 5 minutes. You're kidding me. Okay. All right. In Western cultures in particular, popular culture dominates the cultural landscape. It's located at the centre of and is integral to public sphere. Popular culture serves the role of architect in the design of our society, our lives, and our identities. So how is it that we're going to use this perhaps as a metaphor to think about the ways in which we can work with popular culture in the classroom? And given that I've got 5 minutes, I seriously am going to do a little bit of on-the-fly teaching, folks. Okay, so I would suggest to you that popular culture as an important part of our students' life worlds, their youthscapes. And at this point in time in society and where we are in terms of 2019, next year, popular culture texts have the power to persuade, seduce, shape, control and manufacture imaginations and our student identities in unprecedented ways. It is the case that popular culture is the way in which they fashion and refashion their identities. So again, this nice way of linking the identity work to popular culture. I would like to suggest that the notion of equipping students with the tools necessary to engage in critical work around popular culture, that is to accept, disrupt or reject that which is on offer to them, is forefront of Unit 4 in the Essential English syllabus. Therefore, really powerful. I am going to skip because I do wish to get finished on time before I just got the principal look. Okay. All right, so what I would suggest to you is that if we fail to do this kind of work, that if we fail to get students to engage critically with popular culture, then we run the risk, as Doak and McClanahan suggest, of turning our students into mindless dupes who will consume anything that is served up to them. That is, as readers who are ill-equipped to engage in reflective discriminatory practice. Now, I would like to end on this note, given that I have 2 minutes. I'd like to put it out there that important as it is to engage in critical literacy, teachers must also tread carefully, okay, when we're working with popular culture texts. I would suggest that we need to perform a balancing act. That is, Objectifying and opening up the text to analysis, yes. Making their construction apparent and questioning them, yes. But at the same time, we want to acknowledge the appeal of the texts and the personal investment that our students have in them, okay? And we want to recognise that they take pleasure from these texts. So harking back to my earlier comment, don't kill the text, yeah? Because these students that we work with have a strong investment. Now that is to say, we need to be careful that analysis does not become, as Ray Misson refers to, an invasion of a private space and one that's privileged by students. That's not to say we don't need to do this work, yeah. But we do need to take a balanced approach. So in summary, while I suggest that there is little room to dispute the importance and relevance of using popular culture texts, I also recognise for you that this is not always easy work. Certainly not always comfortable work. And given students' strong investment in these texts, it may well be the case that you encounter the kinds of resistance from students to critical work that you do that is in fact one that does not position you comfortably. You need to be aware that in adopting critical literacy practices, you open up a dialogic space, if you're doing it right, around issues that are often controversial, certainly contemporary, and perhaps quite volatile. Students may well develop positions, critical positions, that are different from the ones that we as teachers might like them to form. Because of this, we need to be vigilant in not abrogating our pedagogical authority in situations where failure to intervene could be seen as condoning inappropriate or undesirable student engagement. So we need to be mindful also of avoiding engaging in our own form of political manipulation in the name of fostering cultural and social sensitivity. Okay. So to sum it up, while I have given you some words of caution, things to think about, which Julie asked me to do, so luckily I got to that by leaving about 5 pages in between, I would suggest that we must, as we engage in popular culture, look to engage with the social landscape of our students, be informed about the contemporary popular culture that students inhabit, turn this into pedagogical advantage that is our own and the students, and engage in cultural critical pedagogy. So, thank you.